Welcome to NoCap Game Design. Today, I'll continue looking at Halo Combat Evolved by exploring the second level, simply titled Halo. In this episode, I talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of open level architecture, the use of enemies as signposts, and I begin talking about enemy design as an introduction to content design in general. In the last episode, the player crash landed onto the Halo rig. The first noticeable thing was how open and sprawling this level architecture is, compared with the Pillar of Autumn. While that first level was dominated with narrow and linear hallways, this second level features open and branching fields. It's not really clear where the player should be going. What are some design considerations when building a large open level? How do the Halo developers keep the player engaged? How do they keep a player moving in the correct direction? In this episode, what are some of the do's and don'ts of big open level architecture design? First things first, where should the player go? There's no clear signpost for the player, so it seems natural for the player to continue in the direction they were facing at the start of the level. Also, the Halo ring is over there. That will draw any player, new or veteran alike. And there's a nice waterfall, a little movement to draw the player's attention. So there's three things pulling the player in this direction. As the player moves away, a few enemies spawn behind them. In the previous level, I said that neon green lights acted as a signpost telling the player where to go. In nature settings like this, neon green lights would be very effective at drawing the player's attention, but it would probably break immersion a little too much. Instead, the developers are using the bad guys themselves as the signposts. As the player walks away, enemies are dropped behind them, so the player is drawn back to the crash pod. It's a flavorful change, or in other words, there's a good in-game reason to justify this spawn. Importantly, there are a couple of enemies that run over this bridge here. After taking care of those new enemies, the player is once again alone. Or are they? Those adventurous grunts who were scripted to immediately cross this bridge are still around, and given enough time, they'd even start shooting the player to really draw their attention. This is how the developers introduce enemies as the true signpost of the game. Enemy spawns pulled the player back to the pod, and enemies are pulling the player across the bridge. This, after all, is a game about shooting aliens. If the player sees an alien, they're going to run towards it and try and kill it. The developers lean into this as a way to pull the players naturally forward. That's only one way that enemies can be used as signposts. Instead of pulling the player forward, they can also be used to push the player forward. These Banshees, there's two of them, are pretty scary. The player is not well equipped to take them on right now, either in skill or with in-game materials. They harangue the player, pushing them forward into this waiting ambush of these ground enemies. And as soon as the Master Chief engages with these enemies, the Banshees make a hasty retreat. Their only job was to push the player forward, and once the player's attention is handed off to the next enemies, the Banshees can fade away into the background. It's different, and therefore is noteworthy, a push versus a pull, but in my opinion, it's less fun being the prey. And the devs also respect this, because there aren't many instances of push signposts in Halo. Most of them are pull signposts. Let's talk about architecture. This level is big and open, so what's the best way to showcase this? Specifically for Halo, what kind of combat does this new terrain allow for? The developers here have elected to use a defend the point style encounter. With a large open field, enemies can drop in on all sides of the player, in front, behind, and above even. It is a much more hectic and unpredictable style of combat, at least compared to the clear forward movement in the Pillar of Autumn. Now, a defend the point style encounter can get boring. If the player is not constantly engaged, then they will quickly lose interest. It's important to ensure there's always something for the player to do. Usually shooting enemies, but maybe also reloading, setting up an ambush, kinda depends on the nature of the encounter. But this is still just level 2. It's unreasonable to expect a new player to have this much situational awareness, let alone the skills to quickly turn around and accurately target a new enemy. So to make things easier, the player gets some allies and a nice high ground structure to defend. If the player gets overwhelmed, they can simply retreat up the ramp and have a strong position, extra ammo, free health, good stuff. It's notable that these goodies are anchoring the player to the best position in the structure, at least in my opinion. What exactly makes this a good defensive structure? Well, firstly, it's an elevated position. There's plenty of other videos on YouTube that can explain why it's a good thing in war settings. Just trust me, having the high ground is a big help. But more for game design, with only 2 ramps up, it makes it easy to hold a position. The enemy AI will come running to you, giving the player some clear and easy shots. And a nice big pile of loot has always been a strong way to give the player a decisive advantage. But whether a player actually decides to hang out atop the structure is up to the player. I know the first few times I played this game, I was down on level footing with these aliens getting up close and personal. So whatever plans the developers had in designing this encounter, it may not have come out as strong as they expected it to.
Look, more lifeboats.
But that's okay, every player will be a little different.
If those lifeboats make it down, the Covenant are going to be right on top of them.
Bowhammer, we need you to disengage your Warthog. The Master Chief and I are going to see if we can save some soldiers. Roger, Cortana. Okay, Charlie Team, Warthog deployed. Saddle up and give 'em hell.
Thanks, Fohammer. Wow, what a nice pseudo cutscene, or a cinematic event that still allows the player control over the camera. Whenever there is a full-blown cutscene, it's very jarring for a player, suddenly taking away control. But with that control, the developers and artists can make an effective and nice cinematics. However, it makes the end product slightly less of a game and slightly more of a movie. Now, sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. For a pseudo cutscene like the one with Fohammer here, it runs the risk of a player missing it entirely. Deciding what is best for your game is more of an art than a science, but here the Halo devs use a healthy mix of both styles. Then again, there aren't that many cutscenes overall in this game, so it's not that big of a design consideration. On to the prize. I will be driving, but the AI is also not awful at driving. With a nice big open level, walking around becomes a chore. If the developers want to show off, look how hugely sprawling our level is, isn't our technology amazing, then it'll get boring quickly, just because it takes a long time to get places. Now, there are a lot of ways to fix the problem of boring travel in video games, but the Warthog here supplies 2 fixes. One, it makes travel itself fun. Driving the Warthog is engaging. It's fun going off of jumps or doing a roll. The ice physics controls of the heavy vehicle make movement slightly challenging and therefore slightly more exciting than walking. And 2, make the player move faster. If the travel is boring, if there are no enemies nearby to kill, then make the travel time shorter by speeding up the player. Clearly taking a car is faster than walking, which allows the player to deliver themselves to the rest of the content much faster. Cortana, say the funny line.
This cave is not a natural formation. Someone built it, so it must lead somewhere.
What an astute observation. Brilliant. Anyways, back to the analysis. Halo is a game with good tempo. While this cave may be unnatural, it is a natural lull in the action. The player needs a moment to catch their breath every once in a while. And constant anything will get stale, even constant excitement. At best, it may simply exhaust a player, and at worst, it will bore them. So one of the minigames, one of the adjacent play loops in Halo, is driving a Warthog around bumpy terrain. It acts as a nice palate cleanser, if you will. Made it through the cave. On to part 2 of this level. The goal here is to meet up and rescue 3 different groups of Marines. Each group has another defend the point style encounter. But first, the player is a little lost. Where should I go? There are no enemies, there's no signposts, nothing that's giving me a clear direction on where to go. Now, the Master Chief is roughly in the middle of this big open valley, and there are a few points of interest. It's clear the devs want the player to explore. There is a brightly lit jackal enemy that stands out, the movement and the orange shield drawing the player's eye. Over here there's a crash pod, something that's interesting to check out, and way off in the distance there are some blinking blue lights. So it's up to the player now. Choose your own adventure, and for me, I choose the blue lights. These lights are a signpost themselves, signaling the player where to go. They show up again in other levels. Halo seems to have several different types of signposts, depending on the environment and tone of the section. There's nothing wrong with that. Having multiple different tools like this allows the developers to mix and match and build more diverse levels. Now, here's the problem with these lights. They don't turn off. Previously, in the Pillar of Autumn, if the player got turned around, the blast doors would close and prevent the player from going the wrong way. That doesn't happen here. Even as I leave this area, notice the lights are still flashing, still acting as a strong signpost, drawing the player in the wrong direction. Given enough time, a waypoint will pop up on the screen and tell the player where to go, notice here, but that's not really satisfying. Design is the practice of making things intuitive. Sometimes these lights are actively frustrating a player, especially in levels that double back on themselves. Be careful with your signposts. Don't accidentally lead the player astray. So, what should the developers have done instead? Well, the lights could have changed colors or simply disappeared. There could have been a small band of enemies defending the entrance. If the enemies are alive, the player hasn't explored the area yet. Perhaps instead of putting the 3 encounters on the edge of a big bowl, they could have all been in a linear progression, and many other suggestions. Each of these has its issues, for sure, which the developers have probably considered, weighing the pros and cons of different designs. But in the end, it seems like they decided that having the player feel a little lost was one of the goals. Enemies keep spawning in the central area, further disorienting the player via combat. Each encounter has 2 entrances, making it easier to get confused. And here you can see that new enemies have spawned at this entrance, making it seem like the right direction. But I've already cleared this area. It definitely adds some emotional texture and provides a sense of scale. The constant exploration burns time, lengthening a game, making a small area seem huge. And the act of exploration itself can be fun. The exploration affordance is a key tenet of game design. Games allow a player to explore virtual space, like alien worlds or fantastic cities. And more abstractly, a player can explore personalities or even experiences. Generally speaking, exploration is good game design. On one end of this exploration affordance spectrum, there is the autoscroller, where the game shows the player exactly where to go, or only allows one dialogue option. In other words, a game with only one direction for the player to explore. On the other end of the spectrum, there is no quest, no goal set by the game for the player to achieve. Simulation games like Minecraft or The Sims try to maximize the possible exploration space. Most games fall somewhere in between. It doesn't really matter where the game lands on this spectrum, as long as you land there intentionally. However, one piece of advice that I will give for the exploration affordance: it is fun to explore, but it is not fun to be lost. In Halo, that means it's not fun when the signposts are leading me in the wrong direction. In your game, that might mean something totally different. Let me repeat this again, because I think it's important. It is fun to explore, it is not fun to be lost. But every person and every game has a different tolerance level for being lost. How much hand-holding the player is expecting, or how often signposts are presented, is really a question about what kind of game the developer is trying to make. And ultimately, any game design question really leads back to the player. How much free time does the player have to play? How long is the average play session? How invested is the player in paying attention to these small details? Identifying a target player like this will help a developer answer more tangible design questions like, what type of signpost should I use? Enemies or lights? How strong of a signals are these signposts? How often will a player see a signpost like this? Every step, every doorway, or perhaps maybe every 10 minutes? In my opinion, Halo Combat Evolved has a little too much confidence in the player's ability to figure out where to go. But clearly, the architecture and game feel isn't too major of a problem. This game still holds up 20 years later. I promised I'd talk about the enemy design, so let's talk about the enemy design. The first most noticeable thing about the aliens is how noticeable they are. Oftentimes they're brightly colored, glowing, and moving around on the screen. Having a bright neon orange shield is not the best strategy when going into war, specifically because it draws attention to the shield bearer. But it's a good thing for games. Last episode I talked about the neon green color acting as a signpost to draw the player into the correct direction, but that principle of colors drawing the player's attention also applies to enemy design. In Halo, bright neon blues, reds, oranges, and greens, those seem to be the favorite color choices of the developers, and those colors signal that the player should pay attention. And it's definitely important for a first-person shooter video game for the player to pay attention to the enemies. It's also worth noting, the more dangerous things are the brightest colored. Alien bullets, the most dangerous of them all, are bright streaks of greens and blues, acting both as a warning to the player, but also as a leading line back to the enemy who shot it. Elites, currently the most powerful enemy the player has encountered so far, have their iconic blue, red, and gold armor, not only standing out among the background, but also standing out amongst other standout colors. Additionally, elites have the brightest shielding effect compared to every other enemy. The bright white particle effect clearly drawing the player's attention, even at a distance and while on a chaotic battlefield. The developers really want the player to pay attention to the elites, and for good reason. The elites are very dangerous. This segues into the concept of screen presence and player attention. A principle of general design, not just game design, is that important elements should stand out and capture a human's attention. In other words, this means that important things should be big, colorful, and moving. What counts as important will change from game to game, and design is halfway between art and science, so sometimes the rules were meant to be broken. But in Halo, the more dangerous a thing is, the more important it is. Even just doing a size comparison to the enemies, the bigger the enemy, the more dangerous it is. Elites are taller than grunts, and aliens tend to be bigger than the Master Chief's human allies. So the more dangerous an element, like an enemy or bullet, the more important that element is. The more important a thing is, the bigger and brighter it is. Applying this principle generally, notice this switch over there. It's very important for the player, so it's brightly colored. In this specific instance, I think this switch should have been a little bigger or a little brighter than it is right now, but the developers had the right idea. Let's look at each enemy in detail. I've done a lot of gushing over the elite species, so I'll start there. I've made the claim that elites are dangerous, but what about them specifically makes them dangerous? Well, they have a powerful shielding effect, that's true, but so do the jackals. The biggest thing that makes elites, well, elite, is how intelligent they are. They can calculate line of sight, and therefore can find effective cover, as demonstrated here. Because of this, it's hard for the player to pin them down or flank them, while at the same time, they're effective at laying down damage on the player. Elites are also very nimble. They can duck and dodge around a stream of bullets, further making them a frustrating target. And if you get too close, they will melee the player. By calculating line of sight and finding cover, elites are effective at a distance. By being nimble and quick, the elites are effective at close quarters. Overall, elites are effective in many situations, making them a challenging problem for a player to solve in almost any type of encounter. It's this, along with their sometimes superhuman accuracy, that earns the elites their species title, and the brightest colors in the game. And while it doesn't have any real gameplay impact, the elites are just really cool. Their design matches their favorite gun, the plasma rifle, and their body plan is a compelling blend of familiar and alien. From an aesthetic standpoint, the elites are really well designed. Next up is the elite's favorite companion, the grunts. They fill the ecological niche of, well, being a grunt, cannon fodder for the player. Their unique shielding effect is they have no shield. They're not smart like an elite, they're not fast, they're not dangerous. Because of this, they don't take up much space in the player's mind, so they also don't take up that much space on the player's screen. Also, while they do have unique colors, they're more earthy tones of orange and red, meaning they're important for a player to pay attention to, but not that important. Grunts tend to rush the player, or at least just stand still, making them an easy target. They are shorter than the elites, sure, but their hitboxes are probably comparable. Grunts are like slow-moving circles, making them easier to hit than the tall and skinny elites. So why is it important to have weak enemies in a game like this? Well, I'll let Mark Rosewater, the head designer for the card game Magic the Gathering, answer this. And I'm paraphrasing and summarizing a series of articles here, but he's made the point that bad cards make good cards good. If all the enemies were really good at killing the player, it might get bland. The elites will look even stronger when standing next to a weakling like a grunt. And sometimes the player just needs a break, some comic stress release. Mowing down panicking grunts is pretty fun. To this end, the grunts make funny sounds and do silly things. When their commanding elite dies, they panic, as shown here. This further makes the elites an important target for the player, but also imbues the grunt with more personality, endearing themselves to the player. Personally, I think the grunt is the most iconic enemy in the entire series, just because of how powerful their personality is, with the elites as a close second. What do you think? What's the most iconic character in the entire series, and why? Let's hash it out in the comments. And last up is the Jackal. Their unique ability is their shield. It's bigger and brighter than they are, so it's safe to assume the shield is probably more important than the Jackal itself. This shield is quite powerful, able to turn aside even a deadly sniper rifle bullet with ease, making it challenging to deal with these guys from a distance. Later in the game, the Jackal will become the de facto long-range unit of the Covenant, and they'll come armed with alien technology sniper rifles. But not yet, this is still just level 2. For a player to kill a Jackal, they need either really good accuracy, or they need to get up close and personal. Jackals are weak to melee attacks, which is unique. Most aliens are fairly indifferent when it comes to sustaining bullets or beatdowns, but the Jackal here can take bullets like a champ, but it can't survive a well-placed punch. The Jackal itself seems to understand this weakness, and if the player gets too close, they'll cover their head and try to run away. Additionally, they have this really cool rolling animation if they've taken too much damage. This roll is probably not a smart move on the Jackal's part, exposing itself to the player's hail of bullets. But from a game design perspective, and especially in a first-person shooter game, you don't really want anything that is immune to bullets. So with enough bullets, the player can create an opening, and even more bullets can make the problem go away. So with all these aliens, it begs the question, why have multiple species of aliens? Why not just have the one best designed species and build the entire game around that? Well, if there was only one type of enemy, the game will get very samey. The player will find the one strategy to beat the one alien and win every time. It wouldn't be fun after a while. But diversity in enemies means more than just having different colored aliens or different body shapes. It means the enemies themselves fundamentally impact the game differently than the other enemies. In other words, different mechanics. Having a large collection of unique attributes and mechanics like this will generate a self-influencing ecosystem. This ecosystem of mechanics and influences between different aliens will ultimately affect what happens in the game. This dense network has a major impact on player decisions. Subtle variations in this ecosystem will have a butterfly effect of compounding changes, making every encounter, every playthrough, unique. As the player learns these relations between the alien and the environment, the aliens and the guns, and even the aliens to the other aliens, it makes a much more rich and compelling game. A dense network of interacting content is the hallmark of a good game. The fundamental building blocks of this network, or the ecosystem, is the content of the game itself. Generally, a healthy ecosystem, or in other words a good game, is one that has a lot of unique pieces of content. In Halo, each alien species has mechanics or attributes that make it unique compared to the other species. Not just in the diversity of the shape or the health of each alien, but also unique mechanics. Each alien has a different tool that it can use. The shielding system, the preferred gun, the decision tree, or AI controlling the aliens. All of these are different for each of the species we just talked about. In this episode, I was mostly focusing on the aliens, but this idea of unique content building a compelling network of mechanics applies to everything in this game. The level architecture, the guns, the mission profiles, the vehicles available to the player, the enemies themselves are just one part of this network. So if a game is an ecosystem of interacting mechanics, then these mechanics need to be of the utmost highest quality. They need to be unique, they need to be compelling, they need to be easy to identify, and they need to be fun to interact with. And once those discrete units of gameplay have been built, the elites, the grunts, the jackals, then a developer can start building them together. For example, the player will fight one elite with 6 grunts. The player, armed with a sniper rifle, will fight 4 elites holding a position far away. With individual pieces of content, a developer can build an encounter. Then a collection of encounters becomes a level, and a collection of levels becomes a game. In this episode, I identified a small subset of these building blocks, the enemies encountered so far. Thinking of content as puzzle pieces building to bigger and grander designs will help us make sense of the rest of the game. In the next level, the devs tell the player to get sneaky, and they introduce the Hunter, the biggest and most dangerous enemy yet. Thanks for watching.